In a seminal article published in mid-2014, Walter Russell Mead proclaimed the return of geopolitics. Mead's contention was that Russia's seizure of Crimea earlier in the year, along with China's assertive claims in the South China Sea and Iran's political maneuvering in the Middle East, heralded the revenge of the revisionist powers. Moreover, he argued, the United States and European states had, since the end of the Cold War, distracted themselves from old-fashioned power plays by an idealistic agenda that emphasized trade liberalization, universal human rights, nuclear non-proliferation and climate change. A front-row seat at the end of history by David Martin Jones and MLR Smith. The return of grand strategy in the Indo Pacific. Believing that the rules of the game had changed, Western nations felt they could move past geopolitical questions of territory and military power and towards issues of world order and global governance. Ignoring the old rules of international politics, however, meant Western powers were vulnerable to being taken by surprise. To be dragged back into old-school contests, such as that in Ukraine, Mead noted, did not just divert time and energy away from the West's idealistic preoccupations, but it also changes the character of international politics. Mead's point, of course, was that the fundamental realities of international relations had not changed, only that Western nations had merely misread the realities, mistaking the ideological triumph of liberal capitalist democracy over communism for the obsolescence of hard power. After 2014, the dawning realization that the West was being led into a new era of great power competition by the revisionist powers resulted in a renewed interest in geopolitics and especially in the notion of grand strategy. Grand strategy represents a commitment to a national vision where the key elements of power, economic, military and social are coordinated to sustain the values and commitments that uphold the vision over the long term. Adherence to a coherent and well-formulated grand strategy on the part of powers like China and Russia placed the West at a disadvantage. From the 2010s onward, books, articles and centers of study sprouted, seeking to rehabilitate the idea of grand strategy as a way of reviving Western understandings of the realities of geopolitics. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 heightened the sense that Western nations required an effective plan that would unify political and military efforts to counter Russian irredentism. In the words of Anthony Cordesman, optimistic rhetoric is no substitute for grand strategic realism. Western powers, according to Cordesman, need to determine what grand strategy they should pursue to shape the longer-term course of the war and its lasting outcome. The felt need for a grand strategic endeavor to unite the West and return it to geopolitical sentience was necessary not only to take on Russia, but also Russia's chief ally, China, whose hegemonic ambitions were also of increasing concern, especially in the region known as the Indo Pacific, the broad expanse of Eurasia extending eastward from Russia towards China and the Pacific littoral in North and Southeast Asia. The course of this essay, then, seeks to dissect the question of how the war in Ukraine has affected the return of grand strategy in the Indo-Pacific. The key contention is, echoing Mead, that grand strategy and geopolitics never really went away in the region. The Russia-Ukraine war has, however, brought pre-existing geopolitical tensions to the surface and represented them in sharper and more aggravated forms in ways that presage serious fault lines in the regional and global order. So, the question this article seeks to address is, after the invasion of Ukraine, what has been the geopolitical fallout for countries on the periphery of this conflict in the Indo-Pacific? To state the obvious, the consequence of the Russia-Ukraine war is that it has forced a great power dividing line between the overt supporters of Russia and its main backer China and the supporters of Ukraine, behind which stands the US and the West more generally. The reaction of the US to Russia's invasion has been that states need to choose between freedom and tyranny, either back Ukraine or be condemned. This stance was expressed in President Joe Biden's Warsaw speech on 26 March 2022 when he declared that democracies must unite in a fight against autocracy. In other words, it was time to pick a side. Were you with Putin and China or with the people of Ukraine and the struggle for democracy and national sovereignty? Such appeals play out in the Indo Pacific largely as a proxy for China's great power aspirations, in particular the degree to which China might wish to forcibly reclaim Taiwan in the way that Russia has attempted to assert itself over Ukraine, and the broader extent to which China is seeking to strong-arm its way to regional dominance by quashing democracy in Hong Kong, oppressing its minority populations, forcefully pressing its claims in the South China Sea, and extending its quasi-imperial reach through the Belt and Road Initiative. The fact that China supports Russia in the conflict suggests, if we are to employ Biden's ideological lens, that the world is confronted by an axis of autocracy comprising Russia, China, and its supporters on the one hand, and an axis of democracy represented by the US and its various allies, most notably in the Indo-Pacific, Japan and Australia on the other. For powers that are not formally allied to or affiliated with either of these axes, the geopolitical challenges are complex. What we see in the Indo-Pacific arena are degrees of alignment, where countries exist in a condition of geopolitical ambiguity. Nations either lean towards or away from these axes, depending largely on their geostrategic position, but also on political traditions, history, and perceived national interests. Those Indo-Pacific nations that are not necessarily connected by formal arrangements with either axis tend to associate by degrees with one side or the other. The countries of Central Asia most obviously lean towards the axis of autocracy and away from the axis led by the US and NATO. These states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, are caught between the competing geopolitical interests of Russia and China. Regardless of what people in these countries think of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, their governments are predisposed not to be critical of Russia's actions, dependent as they are on Russian economic support, energy supplies and working opportunities for their nationals in Russia. Also, these one-party dominant states rely on Russia as a security guarantor. In early 2022, for example, the intervention of Russian security forces ensured the continuing rule of the regime in Kazakhstan in the face of anti-government protests. Equally, the Central Asian states are deferential to Chinese interests and the economic pull of China's Belt and Road investments. All these countries, except for Turkmenistan, function within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, which is the world's largest economic and security cooperation group both by geographical size and population, covering 60% of the Eurasian landmass and 40% of the world's population. The SCO expanded to include India and Pakistan in 2017 and Iran in 2023. It also maintains dialogue partners from across the rest of Asia and the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and the UAE. This is a major developmental defense and security arrangement through which many countries now orbit both China and Russia. In contrast, the states of the Asia-Pacific littoral, Japan, South Korea, and much of Southeast Asia, excluding Cambodia and Myanmar, are primarily concerned with the implications of the spread of Chinese power and influence in the region, and so naturally tilt towards the Western line and a so-called axis of democracy. The Russia-Ukraine war merely sharpens the sense of insecurity in relation to the more assertive line that Xi Jinping's regime promotes to restore China to a position of global preeminence. The main Indo-Pacific players in the axis of democracy therefore wish to offset China's influence via institutions such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad. The Quad comprises Australia, Japan, the US and India. This diplomatic network seeks to reaffirm, according to its joint statement of March 2022, its commitment to an Indo-Pacific in which the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states is respected and countries are free from military, economic and political coercion, all of which can be taken as loosely aimed in the direction of China. Such sentiments broadly accord with the security outlook of most member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which by degrees of hedging and strategic ambiguity bend toward the West. India is a member of the Quad and has historically had a fractious relationship with the People's Republic of China, including several ongoing border disputes that have resulted in armed clashes over the decades. Nevertheless, when it comes to the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on its foreign policy, India provides some interesting pointers in terms of which way the diplomatic wind might be blowing. India represents a third diplomatic dimension, As a major regional power, India's foreign policy is, moreover, heir to a historical tradition of non-alignment between the superpowers. During the Cold War, India leant towards the USSR, especially in military procurements, seeking to counterbalance both US and Chinese power. Consequently, India does not feel any compulsion to align itself over the Russia-Ukraine war, instead preserving the latitude to lean towards or away from these axes as befits its national interests. This trend has been sharpened in the post-Cold War era, in which India increasingly regards itself as a major player in the international system. As a force to be reckoned with, India wishes to chart its own path in world affairs. Over the war in Ukraine, India's non-aligned approach has led to tensions with the US and Europe. As India sees it, the West demands that it should take sides against Russia. The pushback from India is most forcefully expressed by the country's Minister for External Affairs, Dr. Subramanyam Jaishankar, who makes the point that India should not be made to feel that Europe's problems are its problems. This is especially so when India's perception is that the West helped create the conditions that led to the Ukraine crisis through its policy of NATO expansion. India and other states, both within and beyond the Indo Pacific, argue they should not be asked to choose sides and resent it when they are prevailed upon to do so. Thus, what we are witnessing in the Indo Pacific in the light of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a set of complex dynamics, both obvious and less obvious. Firstly, and most perceptibly, the Russia-Ukraine war has forced a dividing line among states in the region, causing some states to align with one or other of these geopolitical axes. Beyond those states that are formally allied with or obviously bound closely to one or other of the axes, in the West's case, Australia, Japan and South Korea, or the Central Asian powers with respect to Russia and China, the responses of other states have been more ambiguous. Much of this ambiguity reflects diplomatic traditions of hedging and non-alignment that one sees across the Indo-Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia. However, some of the ambiguity also speaks to a loss of status, prestige, and economic clout that the collective West has suffered because of the imprudence and hubris embedded within the Western grand strategic project. This has resulted in a grudging and sometimes not so grudging respect for both Russia and China, for standing up for their national interests and civilizational codes against what is perceived to be a liberal imperialist crusade that has seen the West meddle in the internal affairs of countries or intervene directly with military force. The well-known recent examples are, of course, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and Syria, but now includes Ukraine, which for decades has been the object of interest for Western policymakers, principally as a tool to intrude upon Russian geopolitical sensibilities. Several factors are in play here that are acting to weaken the gravitational pull of the West. Notably, the blow to Western prestige wrought by the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, following 2 decades of futile nation-building. Other factors include the deindustrialization and economic waning of the West over 30 years caused by neoliberal economics and the outsourcing of manufacturing capacity to cheaper labor markets elsewhere, and the follies of net zero and the undermining of energy self-sufficiency. Along with the failure of Western financial sanctions against Russia, these factors combine to make the West look weak in contrast to the rising and economically and culturally resilient powers of China and Russia. These factors cause nations to look around and entertain options other than to defer to Western US interests, as they might have felt compelled to do in the past. It is, moreover, the sense of Western double standards that multiplies this alienating effect. The Russian invasion of Ukraine strikes many in the West as an obvious case of aggression. It gets Western governments up in arms about violations of sovereignty and democracy, yet claim other countries. Where were the calls for UN condemnation, sanctions, military intervention and war crimes trials when it was Western countries that were doing the invading, knocking over regimes, destabilizing regions and inflicting humanitarian suffering on host populations? It is this enduring perception of Western inconsistency embedded in notions of the liberal international order that cause nations to doubt the sincerity of Western commitments to freedom and democracy. Along with the sense that liberal imperialism embodies the promotion of individualistic and self-indulgent lifestyles, the character of contending grand strategic visions begins to intimate a clash of civilizations. As a result, this putative clash of cultural worldviews causes states to lean towards the axis of autocracy because they do not necessarily see the other side as an axis of democracy, but as an axis of hypocrisy. In this respect, Western grand strategy and its liberal crusading posture is deeply flawed in conception and execution. Western policy has, consequently, pursued a particularly inept diplomatic path, especially under the current US administration, because it produces outcomes that are seemingly contradictory to prudential calculations of Western geopolitical interests. For example, one reason why China's leaders support Russia and will not allow it to be defeated in Ukraine is the fear that if Russia is routed and the regime in Moscow is overthrown, that they will be the next target. This is not delusional thinking on the part of Beijing. It is a goal that has been canvassed openly in circles close to the Washington foreign policy establishment even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, it does not take a strategic genius to work out that such a policy is guaranteed to drive Russia and China, despite their geopolitical differences, to back each other to the hilt. A smarter Western foreign policy, as was exercised under the previous Trump administration, would be to remain firm but also to actively engage in dialogue with these regimes, which, if Russia had proceeded to invade Ukraine or if China made moves against Taiwan, could well have offered possibilities to play off China against Russia, or vice versa. As it is, the West's for us or against us attitude tends to alienate far more than it attracts, and not just in the Indo Pacific. Important regional players like Saudi Arabia and Brazil, along with many parts of Africa and the Middle East, are increasingly estranged from what they perceive as Western stridency. Furthermore, China has to some extent played a calm diplomatic game. Its appeals for negotiations and a settlement in Ukraine, in comparison to the West's advocacy of escalation and open-ended war, strikes many developing countries as far more reasonable. Not only does this sound more reasonable, but Russia and China are not threatening regime change or sanctions or providing economic investment and developmental aid with all sorts of strings attached. Trade, investment, and non-interference look very attractive in contrast to an ideologically fixated, hectoring West. A West, moreover, that appears increasingly internally divided between its neoliberal globalist elites and its own citizenry. In consequence, the Russia-Ukraine war clearly intimates an emerging multipolar order. States, and not just those in the Indo-Pacific, look around the world and discern that they have options. It's not necessarily the case that they wish to align themselves overtly with China and Russia. The point is that they do not feel the need to choose sides anymore. We are truly in a new world order, just not the one that its end of history architects originally envisaged. The overarching intent behind Western grand strategy to bend the world towards a so-called liberal international order reached its high point between 1991 and 2001. However, its ideological fixation upon an end-of-history teleology has, in the manner that Walter Russell Mead lamented, ultimately rendered Western leaders incapable of making smart, prudential, geopolitical calculations. Their obsessions have ended up dissipating the West's economic and military resources and undermined Western prestige and soft power. An evolving international system where a liberal, some might say woke West, or at least the West's woke elites, are ranged against more traditional societies of the East and the developing worlds, has profound implications for the global order, one of which is the uncomfortable realization that in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, it may well be that the world is isolating the West rather than isolating Russia. Thank you for watching. This video is a chapter in the book, A Front Row Seat at the End of History, by authors David Martin Jones and M.L.R. Smith, and published by the Bruges Group. To view more videos in this series and more content from the Bruges Group, please subscribe to our channel. See you next time.